The name came to Bernard Haskins on the lips of a dying man in the red dust of a New Mexico canyon, spoken with such urgency and such desperate tenderness that Bernard felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone dropping into still water. And he knew, before the last breath left that man's body, that his life had just been redirected by something larger than himself. It was the autumn of 1873, and Bernard Haskins had been riding for 3 days through the high desert country of the New Mexico Territory, tracking a string of stolen horses for a rancher named Gideon Polk, who had promised him fair pay and a warm bunk if he brought even half of them back. Bernard was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean in the way that men who spent more time outdoors than him became lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had seen enough of the world to make him careful about trusting it. He was not a lawman, not quite a bounty hunter, not quite a ranch hand. He existed in the useful middle space between those things, a man who could track and ride and negotiate, who kept his word and his gun clean in roughly equal measure. He had found the horses, or rather, he had found what was left of the situation surrounding them. 3 men had made camp in a shallow canyon where a trickle of a creek ran between red sandstone walls, and by the time Bernard arrived, those 3 men had fallen into a dispute of their own making. 2 of them were gone, ridden off hard to the south judging by the hoof marks, and the third was lying on his back in the dirt near a dead fire, shot through the side, breathing in the shallow, rattling way that told Bernard he would not be breathing much longer. Bernard dismounted slowly. He was not a man who rushed toward trouble when caution would serve better, but there was nothing threatening left in this canyon except mortality itself, and Bernard had made a kind of uneasy peace with mortality over the years. He crouched beside the man, who was perhaps 45, weathered and bearded, wearing clothes that had been better days ago. His eyes opened when Bernard's shadow fell across him. "Water," the man said. Bernard had water. He gave it without question or hesitation, tipping his canteen carefully because a man drowning in his own blood did not need to take in water too fast. The man drank a little and then turned his head and looked at Bernard with eyes that were already going distant. "You headed north?" the man asked. "East mostly," Bernard said, "looking for horses. Horses are gone. Whitmore and Sykes took them east toward the Pecos." The man coughed and the sound was wet and deep and bad. "Listen, I need you to do something. Tell me. There's a woman in a town called Harlan Creek up in the Colorado Territory north of Trinidad, Mary Carver." He said the name the way people said names that mattered to them, with a particular care that went beyond just the syllables. "She doesn't know what happened. She doesn't know about me. I owe her. I owe her a debt I can't pay now." He stopped for a moment and the rattling in his chest grew louder. "My name is Thomas Rudd. You tell her Thomas Rudd is gone. You tell her he was sorry, and you tell her where the deed is." "What deed?" Bernard asked because he was practical above most things. "Deed to 40 acres east of Harlan Creek. It's filed in Denver with the Territorial Land Office under both our names, mine and Mary Carver's. She doesn't know I did it." The man's hand reached up and found Bernard's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so close to the end. "You have to tell her. She deserves to know. She's been working that land for 2 years thinking she had nothing behind her. She's got 40 acres and a filed deed and she doesn't know it. Promise me." Bernard looked at the man's face and saw nothing there but sincerity and desperation, and the particular clarity that sometimes came to people at the very end, when everything unnecessary had burned away and only the true things remained. "I promise," Bernard said, and he meant it, because he was the kind of man who did not say such words lightly. Thomas Rudd exhaled once more and did not inhale again. The canyon was very quiet after that, except for the horses Bernard had not found and the wind that moved through the red stone walls with a sound like someone whispering something too important to be heard clearly. Bernard buried him as well as the hard ground allowed, marked the spot with stones so it could be found again if anyone came looking, and then sat with his own thoughts for a while beside the dead fire. He had a job to finish for Gideon Polk, but the horses were gone east with two men who were already half a day ahead of him and riding hard. He made a calculation in his head that was part practical and part moral, and when it was finished, he turned his horse north. Gideon Polk would be annoyed. Bernard would square it with him later. The horses could be replaced. Mary Carver, wherever she was, could not get a message from a dead man unless someone carried it, and Bernard had promised. The Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1873 was a place of tremendous beauty and real difficulty. The land itself was extraordinary. All granite peaks and aspen groves gone gold with the season, wide valleys, where the light came down in long amber shafts, and made everything look like it belonged in a painting rather than a real life. But the difficulty was real too, the uncertainty of land ownership. The tension between the ranchers who were buying up territory and the smaller settlers trying to hold their ground. The long shadows cast by the railroads moving in from the east and the north, and changing everything they touched about the way people lived and worked and thought about the future. Bernard rode through all of it for nearly 2 weeks, pushing north from New Mexico, stopping at small towns to resupply and ask directions, sleeping under open sky when he had to, and in livery-stable haylofts when he could afford the nicety. He thought about Thomas Rudd more than he expected to. He thought about what kind of man filed a land deed in a woman's name without telling her, and what kind of woman inspired that kind of loyalty from beyond the grave, and whether the debt between them had been the kind that sprang from love or obligation or both, which in Bernard's experience were rarely as separate as people liked to believe. He reached the town of Trinidad in the southern edge of the Colorado Territory on a Wednesday in mid-October, the aspens along the creek that gave the town its character blazing with color in the cold, bright air. He stopped at the land office there, a small building with a territorial flag above the door that snapped in the wind, and confirmed that yes, a deed had been filed in Denver under the names Thomas Rudd and Mary Carver for 40 acres in the Harlan Creek district, and that the filing was legal and registered, and had been for 14 months. The land office clerk, a thin young man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, confirmed all of this in the slightly officious tone that clerks the world over seem to cultivate, and Bernard thanked him and walked back out into the wind. Harlan Creek was another day's ride north, along a narrow valley road that wound between ridgelines covered in dark pine and dropped down periodically into meadows where cattle grazed on the last of the autumn grass. Bernard stopped in the early evening at a small settlement of perhaps a dozen buildings clustered around a Crossroads general store, and the man behind the counter, a broad-chested fellow named Holland with a comfortable gray beard, told him that the Carver place was another 4 miles north, just past where the creek made its second bend, with a white painted gate at the road. "You know the woman?" Bernard asked, buying jerky and dried apples for the road. "Mary Carver." "Sure enough," Holland said, and his tone was one of straightforward respect. "She came out here about 2 years ago, bought a piece of land from old Devereaux, fixed up the house herself near enough, plants a kitchen garden, keeps chickens and 2 milk cows. She's a hard-working woman and she keeps to herself mostly, but she's fair and she doesn't trouble anyone and nobody troubles her." He paused. "She expecting you?" "No," Bernard said. "Well." "She's got a dog that sounds like trouble but isn't," Holland said, handing over his change. "Don't let him fool you." Bernard rode on in the early morning light, the frost of the night still silver on the grass, his breath clouding in front of him and his horse's hooves muffled in the soft earth of the road. The pines on either side smelled of cold and resin and something clean. He was thinking about what he would say, and finding that the more he thought about it, the less certain he was of any particular approach. There was no good way to arrive at a stranger's door with news that someone who had clearly cared about her was dead. There was only the necessity of doing it. He came around the second bend of the creek and saw the white gate. It stood at the end of a short lane that led to a modest house, well kept in the way that spoke of real and regular effort rather than casual tidiness. The house had been whitewashed recently. The porch had a rocking chair and a small table, and a clay pot of late-blooming purple asters that had survived the first frosts by the protection of the porch roof. The kitchen garden Holland had mentioned was visible to the side, its beds turned over for winter, the soil dark and neatly mended. A barn stood behind the house, red-painted, its doors open, and from inside came the morning sounds of animals being tended. And at the white gate, as if she had been standing there waiting, was Mary Carver. She was 26 years old, and she was the kind of woman who stood in the world with a quality that Bernard had no better word for than composed, not cold, not distant, but settled in herself in a way that suggested she had done her thinking and made her peace with the results. She had dark auburn hair pinned up under a plain bonnet, a few loose strands catching in the morning breeze, and she wore a work dress of deep blue wool with an apron over it, and she was looking at him with dark brown eyes that were steady and intelligent, and he noticed, not entirely surprised. The dog Holland had mentioned, a large and shaggy red-brown creature, stood beside her with its ears up, looking at Bernard with professional suspicion but not barking. Bernard reined in his horse at the gate and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. Her voice was clear and even with a faint trace of something southern in it, Tennessee or Kentucky, he guessed. She looked at him for a moment, and then her eyes did something complicated, a quick internal assessment passing behind them like a cloud across a high-country sky. "You have news," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am," Bernard said, and found that he was suddenly very aware of the weight of what he was carrying. "I do. My name is Bernard Haskins. I was riding through southern New Mexico about 2 weeks ago and I came across a man in a canyon who was badly hurt." She did not move, did not change her expression much, but something in her face went very still. "Thomas Rudd," she said. It was not a question at all. "Yes," Bernard said. "I'm sorry, ma'am, he didn't make it. I did what I could." He paused, because the words were never enough for this kind of thing, but they were what he had. "He asked me to come find you. He had things he wanted you to know." Mary Carver reached out with one hand and rested it on the top of the gate post, not for support exactly, but as if grounding herself to something solid. The dog pressed against her leg. She looked at Bernard for a long, quiet moment, and then she unlatched the gate. "You've been riding a long way," she said. "Come inside. I'll put on coffee." He did not know what he had expected from that moment, but it was not the quiet, practical dignity with which she received the news. He followed her up the lane and around to the back of the house, where a lean-to porch served as a mudroom, and he hung his hat on the peg she indicated, and he sat at the kitchen table in a room that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and drying herbs hanging from the rafters, and she put water on and moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. When she finally sat down across from him with 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee between them, she said, "Tell me everything he said. Please don't leave anything out because you think it will spare me. I'd rather have all of it." So Bernard told her. He told her about the canyon and the dead fire and the 2 men who had ridden south. He told her about the water and what Thomas Rudd had said about the debt and the apology, and then he told her about the deed. Her hands tightened around her mug when he said that. She looked down at the table for a moment, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with something that was not entirely grief. "He did that," she said softly, to herself more than to Bernard. "He actually did that." "You didn't know," Bernard said. "No, we had talked about it years ago before I came out here. He said he'd look into it. I didn't think," she stopped and pressed her lips together. "We weren't Thomas and I weren't what people might assume. He was my father's oldest friend. When my father died, Thomas looked after me in his way. He was not always a steady man, but he was a good one underneath." She paused again. "He owed me nothing, nothing that matters as much as this." "He seemed to think otherwise," Bernard said. "Yes, that was Thomas." She looked out the window at the morning light moving across the turned garden beds. "He should have told me, but that was also Thomas." He did things quietly and then disappeared before you could thank him for them. They sat for a while in the kind of silence that did not require filling. Bernard drank his coffee, which was strong and good, and watched the woman across the table absorb what he had brought her, and found himself thinking that she was not what he had imagined during the 2 weeks of writing. He had imagined someone softer, or more fragile, because people who needed news delivered gently were sometimes those things. Mary Carver was not soft in the fragile sense. She was soft the way good leather is soft, the kind that has been worked and worn until it has perfect flexibility and unquestionable strength. "You came a long way out of your way," she said finally, looking at him directly. "What brought you from New Mexico into Colorado territory? You don't seem like a man who would have had business up here." "A promise," Bernard said simply. She studied him. "You made a promise to a dying man you didn't know and rode 2 weeks out of your way to keep it." "He asked nicely," Bernard said, and there was just enough lightness in his voice to let her know it was not entirely a serious answer, but not so much that it dismissed the gravity of what he'd done. Something changed in her face then. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical shift, but in the small increments that real expressions are made of. The corners of her eyes softened a fraction. "Well," she said, "Mr. Haskins, you're welcome to stay a few days, rest your horse. I have a spare room that my neighbor's boy uses when he comes to help with the heavy work, but he's finished for the season. It would be wrong to send you back on the road the same day you arrived." "I don't want to be any trouble," Bernard said. "You've ridden 2 weeks to tell me something important," she said. "The least I can do is feed you properly and let you sleep under a roof." She stood and carried her mug to the wash basin. "Do you know anything about fence mending?" He blinked. "Some." "Good." "Because the north pasture fence came down in the last windstorm, and the cattle keep drifting, and my neighbor's boy isn't coming back until spring." She looked at him over her shoulder with that calm, level gaze. "You can earn your room and board, if that suits you." Bernard Haskins thought about Gideon Polk's horses somewhere east of the Pecos, thought about the road back south, thought about the rooms at the bottom of various saloons he had spent too many nights in over the past several years, and then he looked at the kitchen with the herbs drying from the rafters and the clean-swept floor, and the woman standing by the wash basin with a practical expression and dark brown eyes that knew exactly what they were about. "It suits me," he said. The next morning Bernard was up at dawn and working on the north pasture fence before Mary had finished with the chickens, and by the time she came out to check his progress mid-morning with a tin cup of coffee and a thick slice of bread with butter and honey, he had replaced 3 broken posts and was working on a 4th. She stood at the edge of the pasture and watched him work for a moment before she spoke. "You're efficient," she said, and there was approval in it. "I've mended a lot of fence," he said, accepting the coffee with thanks. "Different places." "Where are you from originally?" she asked. It was not idle conversation. He could hear the genuine curiosity in it. "Indiana," he said. "Long time ago, my family farmed. I left when I was 19 and went west." "Why?" He considered the question, which was the kind of question most people in the West did not ask directly because most people had reasons they preferred not to discuss. But Mary Carver asked it the way she seemed to do most things, directly and without apology. "I wanted to see what was out here," he said. "And there was a girl in Indiana who chose someone else, and staying felt worse than leaving." He took a drink of the coffee. "So I left." "And you've been moving ever since," she said. Not an accusation, merely an observation, more or less. "There's something both admirable and sad about that," she said, and then she picked up the empty cup when he finished and walked back toward the house, leaving him to consider whether she was right about both parts. Over the following days, Bernard worked steadily through the list of repairs that the property needed and that Mary had clearly been managing around the edges of because there were not enough hours in her day to do everything. He fixed the fence. He rehung the barn door that had been sticking. He cleared the drainage channel beside the kitchen garden that had silted up and was pooling when it rained. Mary fed him well and treated him with a frank and easy hospitality that was neither flirtatious nor cold, but simply generous and steady, the way she seemed to be with everything. In the evenings after supper, they sat in the main room by the fire, and they talked. This was where Bernard began to really understand who she was. She had come from Kentucky, she told him, where her father had run a small dry goods store in a town outside of Lexington. When he died, she had been 23 and she had looked at the life ahead of her in Kentucky, the comfortable narrowness of it, the expectations of who she ought to marry and how she ought to live, and she had felt something in herself say quietly but firmly, no. She had corresponded with Thomas Rudd, who had gone west several years before, and she had taken what her father left her and come to Colorado Territory and bought her piece of land. "People thought I was out of my mind," she said one evening, feeding another log into the fire. "A woman alone, coming west. Some of them thought Thomas and I were going to marry, but we weren't. We were never that to each other." She looked at the fire. "He helped me find the land and helped me get settled, and then he moved on. He was a moving man." She paused and smiled faintly. "Like you." "I've been moving," Bernard said. "I'm not sure that's the same as being a moving man." She glanced at him. "What's the difference?" "I think a moving man is always looking for the horizon," he said. "I've been moving, but I've been moving because I didn't find what I was looking for. Those are different things." "And what were you looking for?" she asked. Bernard was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. He was a careful man with words, not because he was dishonest, but because he took them seriously. "Something that felt worth staying for," he said finally. The fire crackled between them. The dog, whose name was Copper and who had by this point decided that Bernard was acceptable company, was stretched out on the braided rug between their chairs. The wind moved against the windows. Mary Carver looked at the fire for a long moment and did not say anything, but Bernard had the distinct impression that something had been registered, filed, considered. On the fifth day, Bernard rode into Harlan Creek proper, a larger settlement than Holland's Crossroads, with a proper main street and a hotel and a land office and a sheriff's office and a bank and 2 saloons. Because the mining in the hills above the valley had brought people in over the past decade, and people needed places to spend money when they came down from the hills. He went to the land office and confirmed that the deed transfer was proper, and that Mary Carver had only to present identification and Thomas Rudd's death information to claim clear title to the 40 acres. The land office clerk was a woman named Mrs. Pierce, brisk and efficient and surprisingly helpful, who walked him through the process and told him that as long as the territorial filing in Denver was in order, which it apparently was, the transfer could be completed within a few weeks. On the way back down the main street, Bernard stopped at the general store for a few supplies, and while he was waiting for the clerk to wrap his purchases, he became aware of a conversation at the counter beside him between 2 men who were speaking with the particular directness of men who had decided they did not care who heard them. Carver woman still holding that east parcel, the larger of the 2 men was saying. He was thick through the neck and wore a good quality jacket and the kind of hat that said money without saying it too loudly, because Vickers says she's never going to make a go of it, and when she folds he wants first option. "She's not folding," the other man said. "She's been there 2 years. That's not folding, that's settling." "She's a woman alone," the first man said. "There's a limit to what one woman alone can do with 40 acres and a house." Bernard did not look at them. He accepted his parcel from the clerk and paid for it and walked out, and on his horse on the way back down the valley road, he thought about the man named Vickers and the thick-necked man in the good jacket and what they represented, which was a pattern he had seen enough times across enough different territories to recognize it clearly. People who waited for others to struggle so they could step in at the moment of maximum weakness. He did not mention this to Mary that evening. He thought about it, but he decided she had enough on her mind with the news about Thomas Rudd and the land deed situation, and the conversation he had heard was still just that, a conversation. Men talking did not necessarily mean men acting, but he did mention it 2 days later, when the occasion presented itself naturally. They were working together in the barn, Mary checking over her 2 milk cows, Bernard repairing a stall rail that had been cracked for too long, when she said, almost casually, that a man named Amos Vickers had offered to buy her out 3 times in the past 6 months and was becoming less pleasant with each refusal. Bernard straightened and looked at her. "What does he do when you refuse?" "He smiles," she said, with a tone that made it clear the smile was not pleasant. "And he says things like, 'The offer stands, Miss Carver, whenever you come to your senses,' as if the only thing standing between me and sense is my own stubbornness." "I heard someone mention him in town," Bernard said, and told her what he had overheard. She was quiet for a moment, her hand moving along the flank of the nearer cow with a steady, reassuring motion. "I thought as much," she said. "He's been accumulating land up and down this valley for the past year. He's got backers somewhere, Denver maybe, or further east. He wants this whole valley eventually." "Your deed makes your position stronger," Bernard said. "Once that transfer goes through, it's considerably harder to pressure you out." "I know," she said, "which is one more reason I'm grateful to Thomas." She looked at Bernard directly. "And to you." "I just delivered the message," he said. "A lot of men would have ridden past without stopping," she said. "Don't dismiss what you did." He found to his faint surprise that he did not know what to say to that. He was not accustomed to being thanked. He picked up his hammer and went back to the stall rail. That evening after supper, while the fire was low and comfortable and the wind had died outside, Mary Carver did something unexpected. She came back to the table from the small shelf of books along the wall carrying a battered copy of Jane Eyre, and she set it on the table with both hands flat on the cover and looked at Bernard with an expression that was entirely serious. "Have you read this?" she asked. "No," he said. "Do you read?" "Yes," he said, with a faint edge that was not quite offense but was adjacent to it. She heard it and her mouth curved very slightly. "I didn't mean it as an insult. A lot of men in this territory have had very little occasion for books. I was asking because I like to read aloud in the evening sometimes, and I wasn't sure if you'd find it unbearable or not." "Read," he said. So she did. She read for perhaps an hour, in a voice that was clear and steady and expressive without being theatrical, and Bernard sat across the table with his coffee cooling at his elbow and listened, and found that the story was not entirely unlike things he understood. A person trying to hold onto their own sense of self in circumstances that conspired against them. Love complicated by pride and circumstance, and the particular difficulty of 2 people who both had more interior life than they showed. When she stopped at the end of a chapter, she looked up and found him looking at her, and she seemed briefly surprised by whatever she saw in his expression, because she looked down quickly and closed the book. "We should probably sleep," she said. "Probably," he agreed. He lay awake in the small spare room for a long time that night, looking at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the house settle around him. And he thought about Jane Eyre, and about Thomas Rudd's last words, and about Mary Carver's hands flat on the book cover, and about Amos Vickers smiling and saying the offer stands. And he thought about Indiana and the girl who had chosen someone else, and the 19-year-old version of himself walking west with everything he owned in a pack, and a great deal of empty space in front of him. He was not 19 anymore. The empty space had gotten smaller over the years, not because he had filled it exactly, but because he had learned to live alongside it. But lying in this small, clean room in the house that Mary Carver had built by the force of her own will and her own hands, he felt something shift, some internal arrangement of the furniture of himself moving toward a new configuration. He told himself he was romanticizing because he had been alone on the road for too long, and this was a warm house with good food and good company, which were all things that could make a man soft in his thinking if he was not careful. He told himself that convincingly enough to fall asleep. 2 days later, on a bright cold morning with the first light snow dusting the peaks above the valley, Amos Vickers came to the white gate. Bernard saw him coming from the barn where he was splitting wood for the winter, 3 weeks of early and serious effort that had produced a satisfying wall of stacked split logs along the side of the barn. He stopped splitting and watched. Vickers rode a good gray horse and had a man with him, a large, quiet man who rode slightly behind and whose function was clearly to be large and present and remind people of the option of difficulty. Mary came out onto the porch when she heard the horse. She had been baking, and she wiped her hands on her apron and stood at the top of the porch steps, and she looked at Vickers with an expression that Bernard would have described as professionally civil. It was the expression of a woman who had dealt with this before and intended to continue dealing with it as long as necessary. Vickers dismounted at the gate. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that might have been pleasant if it had developed a different relationship with what it wanted. He was well-dressed and well-groomed, and he had the calculated pleasantness of a man who had learned that appearing reasonable was useful even when he was not. "Miss Carver," he said, lifting his hat. "Beautiful morning." "Mr. Vickers," she said, "I'm riding the valley this morning checking on a few things, and I thought I'd stop by, see how you're managing with the season coming on." His eyes moved with professional casualness to the wood stack along the barn, which was clearly the result of recent and significant effort, and then to Bernard standing beside it with the axe in his hand. He noted Bernard the way a man notes a variable he had not accounted for. "You have someone helping you." "I do," Mary said. She did not offer any further information. "That's good," Vickers said, and his tone was very slightly recalibrated. "That's good. Always good to have reliable help." He looked back at her. "I wanted to renew my offer for the property. I think my last figure was $420. I'm prepared to go to $500, given the improvements I can see you've made." "I appreciate the offer," Mary said, in a tone that sounded like appreciation and meant nothing of the sort. "The answer is still no, Mr. Vickers." He smiled. "Miss Carver, I want to be straight with you. The winter coming on is going to be difficult. The mining up top is slowing down, which means fewer people buying from local farms. The railroad land purchases up near Pueblo have been disrupting market prices. It's going to be a hard few months for small operations." "I've had hard months before," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said. "You're a capable woman, but capable doesn't make the economics easier." He looked at the property with the measuring eye of a man who was appraising rather than admiring. $500 would set you up very comfortably somewhere with a lot fewer difficulties. "This land is not for sale," Mary said, and the quietness in her voice had a quality that Bernard recognized as the kind of quiet that was harder than shouting. "It was not for sale last month, and it will not be for sale next month. I thank you for the ride out, Mr. Vickers, but I have bread in the oven." Vickers looked at her for a moment. Then his eyes went back to Bernard, measuring, calculating. "Well," he said pleasantly, "the offer stands." He mounted the gray horse and touched his hat brim. His large, quiet companion had not spoken a word during the entire exchange. They rode back down the lane and through the gate and onto the road. Bernard walked up to the house. Mary was still standing at the top of the porch steps, watching them go. When she finally turned and looked at Bernard, something in her face was tired in a way that her face was not usually tired. "He comes more often," she said. "Every few weeks now. It used to be every few months." "He's increasing pressure," Bernard said. "I know." She looked at the road where the two horses were now small figures moving north. "I'm not afraid of him, but I am tired of him." "The deed," Bernard said. "Once that's fully transferred, it's a legal position that's harder to harass." "I know that too." She went back inside. After a moment, Bernard followed. That afternoon she rode to Harlan Creek and came back with the paperwork she needed for the land transfer. Bernard went with her, partly because he knew the process from his visit to the land office, and partly because Vickers and his companion had been riding north, which was the direction of town. He did not say the second reason aloud, and she did not ask, but he thought she understood it. Mrs. Pierce at the land office was efficient and kind, and she walked Mary through everything she needed and told her to return with a witness, and the completed forms and the deed transfer would be submitted to Denver. Mary thanked her with a warmth that was genuine and came back out into the cold afternoon street looking lighter in her face than she had looked going in. 2 weeks and it's done, she said. You own 40 acres free and clear, Bernard said. Thomas, she said softly, shaking her head. The grief was there still, underneath the practical business, but she carried it the way she seemed to carry most things, with quiet dignity rather than performance. He was infuriating sometimes, but he was a good man. They ate supper at the hotel restaurant in Harlan Creek that evening because they were already in town, and it was too late to start back before dark. And Mary had a small room at the hotel that she occasionally used when she came to town on business. Bernard got himself a room down the hall, and they ate in the small, low-ceilinged dining room where the food was plain but adequate, and the other diners were mostly mining men and a few families. It was the first time Bernard had seen Mary in a context that was not her own house and her own land, and he noticed things he had not quite articulated before. The way other people in the room looked at her, not dismissively, not with hostility, but with a particular kind of respectful assessment that said they had come to their own conclusions about who she was and found those conclusions favorable. The hotel owner, a compact woman named Mrs. Hart, greeted Mary by first name and asked after her cows. A man across the room, a weathered older fellow with a rancher's bearing, nodded to her with the gravity of someone acknowledging an equal. Mary Carver had built something here. Not just the house and the farm, but a place in the community, a standing, a reputation. She had done it quietly and completely and without anyone having given it to her. Bernard found himself thinking, as they walked out of the restaurant into the cold, dark street, that he had ridden out of Indiana at 19 looking for something worth staying for, and he was 37 years of life old, and 9 years of wandering along the spine of the West. And this was the first time he had been standing in a particular place and thought, without any rhetorical distance, that this was it. He was quiet on the walk back to the hotel, and Mary, who was attentive to people in the way that suggested she found them genuinely interesting rather than merely navigating them, noticed. "You're thinking loudly," she said. "How can you tell?" he asked. "You stop making the small commentary about your surroundings," she said. "You've been doing it since we got to town. You notice things and say small things about them. The sign on that building is crooked. The horse at that rail needs its shoe checked. That kind of thing. When you go quiet, you're thinking something specific." He looked at her in the dark of the street, the oil lamp light from the hotel window making the frost in the air visible around them, and he made a decision. Bernard Haskins was not a man who made decisions the way some people made them, impulsively and then reconsidered. He made them carefully and then he committed. "I'm thinking about whether to stay in Harlan Creek," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why would you stay? Your work is in New Mexico." "My work is where there's work," he said. "And there's work here. Vickers is accumulating land and putting pressure on people. A man who can track and negotiate and knows something about law and land has a use in a situation like that. There are other small farms in this valley, I'd guess, in the same position as yours." Mary looked at him with the directness that was so essentially her. "And that's the only reason you'd stay?" she asked. The air between them was cold and still and very clear. Bernard met her eyes. "No," he said. She absorbed that. She nodded once, as if something had been confirmed that she had been thinking about. "Then stay," she said, with a simplicity that was not casual but rather the simplicity of a woman who knew her own mind and trusted it. And she went into the hotel. Bernard stood outside in the cold for a moment longer, looking at the dark street and the lamplit windows and the frost in the air, and he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular and specific warmth of knowing exactly where you were supposed to be. He rode back to the Carver place the next morning with his mind settled in a way that was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Mary was already up and working, which was simply the fact of who she was, and she put coffee on and they talked practically about what staying might look like, which was the way two people who were both practical and honest about themselves tended to handle things that were emotionally large, by approaching them from the practical side first. The spare room was available. There was more work to be done before true winter set in. Bernard had some savings from his tracking work, enough to contribute to supplies without making it a charity situation on either side. He could ride into Harlan Creek and speak with some of the other valley farmers about the vicar's situation, see what the pattern was and what might be done. None of this was a declaration. It was the architecture of a shared life being quietly assembled from practical lumber. But both of them knew what was being built, even if neither of them said so directly for several more days. It was the reading aloud that broke the formality of it, or rather, it was something that happened during one of the evening reading sessions, which had become a regular part of the days. Mary had moved on from Jane Eyre to a collection of poetry that her father had given her, a battered volume with a cracked spine and penciled notes in the margins in two different hands, her father's firm printing and her own earlier, smaller cursive. She was reading a Tennyson poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, having been selected by Bernard himself because he liked the sound of it, and she read it through once with proper attention to the meter, and then she lowered the book and looked at him and said, with no particular lead-up, "I think about you leaving." He looked up from his coffee. "I've told you I'm staying." "I know," she said. "But staying in the valley and staying here are different things. And I think about you leaving the valley eventually because men do. And I have noticed that the idea of that is uncomfortable to me in a way that tells me something." She put the book on the table with both hands, the same gesture as before with Jane Eyre, and he realized it was what she did when she was saying something important and wanted her hands to be free. "I'm not very practiced at this," she said, "at saying things like this. I've spent 2 years mostly talking to my cows." Bernard set his coffee down. "Mary," he said, and the way he said her name with the full weight of attention he was capable of made her look at him steadily. "I came here to deliver a message and I stayed because I could not make myself leave. That has nothing to do with fence posts or land deeds or Amos Vickers. I know what it means. I'm fairly sure you know what it means. I don't want to say it before you're ready to hear it." "Say it," she said. "I love you," Bernard said, in the plain and direct way that he did most things. "I know that's a fast thing to feel. I know it hasn't been very long, but I've been living alongside it for 2 weeks pretending it was something else, and it isn't." Mary Carver looked at him across the table, the fire behind her casting its warm light, the book with her father's handwriting in the margins between them, and her face was open in a way it was not always open, the composed quality she wore so naturally set aside. And what was underneath it was not soft in the fragile sense but in the real sense, the warm and genuine and unguarded sense. "I've been feeling the same way for longer than I'd like to admit," she said. "Which is 10 days, but in the kind of circumstance we've been in that feels like considerably more." Bernard stood up from his chair and came around the table, and Mary stood to meet him, which was characteristic of her, and he took her face in both of his hands with great care, and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same direct and genuine quality she brought to everything else. The dog Copper sighed heavily from his position on the rug, apparently unimpressed by the development, and the fire crackled, and the wind moved against the windows outside, and neither of them paid the slightest attention to any of it. The weeks that followed had a quality that Bernard had not experienced before, not even when he was young and the world had seemed full of possibility, which was the quality of something he had been told about theoretically actually coming true. He was not a romantic in the conventional sense. He did not lose his practical judgment or his careful nature. But there was a warmth in the center of everything now, present even on the cold mornings when the frost was heavy and the work was hard and demanding, that had simply not been there before. He rode the valley and spoke with other farmers. The picture that emerged was consistent with what he had suspected. Amos Vickers had bought out 4 properties in the past 18 months. in each case from people who had been under financial pressure, and he had not always been entirely above board in how that pressure was applied. A widow named Mrs. Greer on the south end of the valley told Bernard, with a tight-lipped anger that was the compressed residue of real grief, that the spring that served her main pasture had been blocked upstream 3 months before she sold, and though she could not prove it, she knew. A younger farmer, Carl Duplessis, who had come from Louisiana with his wife and 2 children to homestead 40 acres of valley land, told Bernard that Vickers's man, the large quiet one who rode behind him, had come to his place twice at odd hours to remind him that the offer was available, and that both visits had felt like they were designed to feel threatening. Bernard wrote a careful letter to the Territorial Land Office in Denver explaining the pattern, and another to the nearest circuit judge's office in Pueblo. He also spoke with Mrs. Pierce, who confirmed that the water rights on the Greer property transfer had been changed in ways that were legally questionable, and that she had her own concerns about the paperwork involved. None of this was going to be quick. The wheels of territorial law were slow and imperfect, and often tilted by money and influence, as Bernard knew from experience. But the point was not to produce an instant resolution. The point was to create a documented record that made Vickers's position harder to maintain over time, and to make it clear to the people of the valley that they were not alone. Mary's deed transfer came through from Denver in early November, and she rode back from the land office with it in her coat pocket, and her face carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who has secured something they worked for. Bernard met her at the white gate because he was working on the garden fence nearby, and she dismounted and came through the gate and held up the folded document. 40 acres, she said. Mine. Yours, he agreed, and there was a pride in his voice that he made no effort to hide. She folded the document back into her pocket and looked at him, and there was a question in her eyes that had not quite become a question yet. Bernard recognized the look because he had been having similar thoughts and he suspected they both knew it. "Walk with me," he said. They walked the property. The east 40 acres which she had been farming and maintaining as if she owned them all along, because in some practical sense Thomas Rudd's intention had always been that she would. The field that would go to wheat in the spring. The creek running along the eastern boundary, winter cold and very clear. The small stand of aspens at the corner, leafless now, their white trunks stark against the gray sky. Bernard stopped at the corner of the aspen grove and turned to face her. The cold had put color in her cheeks, and she was looking at the aspens with an expression that was thinking rather than seeing, and then she looked at him. "Bernard," she said. "I know," he said. "You do?" A faint smile. "I think we've been having the same conversation in our heads for about a week," he said. She considered this. "We'd need to go into Harlan Creek," she said. "The minister there is reasonable. He's performed marriages for a few homesteaders over the past year." "I know," Bernard said. "I spoke with him last week, when I went in to post the letters to Denver." She looked at him with an expression that was surprised and amused in equal measure. "You spoke with the minister without having asked me first." "I spoke with him to find out what the process required," Bernard said, with a composed dignity that was perhaps slightly undermined by the warmth that was clearly visible in his expression. "I had not assumed your answer. I had hoped for it. Those are different things." "They are different things," she agreed. She reached out and took his hand, which was gloved against the cold, and he felt the pressure of it through the leather. "Yes, Bernard Haskins," she said. "Ask me properly." He did. He did not have a ring yet, and he told her so plainly, because he was not the kind of man who made a gesture he could not immediately back with substance. But he told her that he would get one, and that it would be a good one. And he told her that he intended to stay in Harlan Creek Valley, and that he intended to be useful to her and to the farm, and to the community in whatever ways he could. And that he was asking her to marry him not out of any sense of obligation or propriety, but because she was the most extraordinary person he had met in his life, and the idea of any version of his future that did not include her was one he found entirely unacceptable. Mary Carver stood in the aspen grove with the winter sky above her, and looked at him with those dark brown eyes that were steady and warm and entirely genuine. And she said yes. They were married in the first week of December 1873, in the small white church in Harlan Creek, on a Saturday morning when the snow was falling in large soft flakes that turned the town quiet and clean, and made everything look like the inside of a snow globe. The minister was indeed reasonable, a man named Reverend Calloway who had come west from Ohio and had the practical and unshowy approach to faith that seemed to suit the territory well. Mrs. Hart from the hotel came, and Holland from the Crossroads store, and Carl Duplessis and his wife Elise, and Mrs. Greer in her best Sunday clothes with her eyes bright and her spine very straight. Mrs. Pierce from the land office came and brought flowers she had somehow kept alive in her house through the first frosts, winter asters and dried lavender bound together. Bernard stood at the front of the church in his cleanest coat, which he had brushed until it was presentable, with a ring he had found in the jewelry case of the general store, a simple gold band that was not ostentatious but was solid and well made. He watched Mary come through the door of the church in a dress the color of a winter sky, deep blue wool with white at the collar, and he thought that he had spent a great deal of his life moving toward this room without knowing it. She walked to him without a hand to hold on to, because there was no father left to give her away, and she was not the kind of woman who required that gesture, and she came to stand beside him with a composure that he recognized now not as distance but as strength, the quiet strength of a woman who knew herself. The ceremony was short and honest and exactly right. They said their vows looking at each other rather than at the minister, because the words were for each other rather than for the room, and when Reverend Calloway said they were married, the small gathering of people erupted in the particular warmth of people who are genuinely happy for two specific others, which is a different and better thing than the polite celebration that weddings sometimes produce. Mrs. Duplessis had made a cake. This turned out to be a remarkable development because Elise Duplessis had been a baker in Louisiana before she came west, and the cake was layered and iced, and entirely out of proportion with the modest occasion in the most delightful possible way. They ate it in the church's small reception room with coffee and warmth, and the snow continued outside, and Bernard kept finding that he was holding his wife's hand without having made a conscious decision to do so, and she kept letting him. The winter settled in properly after that, and the valley went quiet in the way that all high country places go quiet when the snow comes, not hostile but simply changed, the pace and nature of life adjusting to the new conditions. The farm required different work in winter than in summer and fall, the daily care of the animals, the management of the wood supply, the maintenance of water sources against freezing. Bernard had grown up with farm winters, and he moved into the rhythms of it with the ease of old memory. They were good together in all the ways that mattered. In the practical rhythms of the farm, Mary's knowledge of what the land needed and Bernard's capacity for the heavy physical work met in a kind of efficient partnership that felt like it had been running longer than it had. In the evenings by the fire, the reading aloud continued, taking on a new quality now that they could sit closer together, Mary reading with Bernard's arm around her and the dog at their feet, and the winter storm doing its work outside without disturbing anything inside. They talked in those evenings at lengths and depths that Bernard had not managed with most people in his life, about their childhoods and their ideas and their opinions and their fears. He learned that she had been frightened, truly frightened, in her first year on the land alone, in a way that she had not let anyone see at the time. She learned that he had come very close, in his late 20s, to going back to Indiana and settling for something he did not want. And what had stopped him was not courage exactly, but a stubbornness about the idea that you could simply surrender your own life to someone else's expectations. "We are both," she said one evening in January, looking at the fire, "profoundly stubborn people." "Is that a problem?" he asked. "I think it's probably what we needed," she said. "I think if either of us had been less stubborn, we'd both have ended up somewhere smaller." He kissed the top of her head and she leaned into him, and the fire was warm and Copper was asleep on the rug, and outside the snow was clean and deep across the valley. The vicar's situation resolved itself with more drama than Bernard had anticipated, but less violence than he had feared. In February, a territorial inspector arrived from Denver following the letters Bernard had written and the complaint that Mrs. Pierce had filed through official channels. The inspector was a careful, methodical man named Aldrich who wore very good boots and spoke very little, and he spent 2 weeks in the valley examining land records and water rights documents and the paperwork surrounding Vickers's property acquisitions. Vickers, when he became aware of the investigation, made several poor decisions that people under pressure and accustomed to operating in comfortable shadows tend to make. He sent his large, quiet companion to visit Carl Duplessis with what appeared to be an intimidation mission, and Duplessis, who had been prepared for exactly this, had 3 witnesses present and a 4th man riding immediately to fetch Aldrich. The large, quiet man was named Colbert, and Colbert, when faced with a territorial inspector and 3 witnesses and his own significant history of facilitating land pressure, made a decision of his own about where his loyalties lay when things became official. What Colbert told the inspector was sufficient to establish that the blockage of Mrs. Greer's spring had been deliberate and carried out on Vickers's instruction, and that 2 of the 4 previous land purchases had been conducted through material misrepresentation of conditions on which the sellers had relied. Vickers left Harlan Creek in the early spring of 1874 with considerably less than he had arrived with, following a legal settlement that required him to compensate 2 former landholders and divest his holdings in the valley to a legitimate land trust administered by the territorial government. He was not arrested, because the territorial law was not quite strong enough in its application to reach to arrest in this situation without a longer process than anyone had the appetite for, and Bernard thought about that limitation honestly and with some frustration. But he was removed from the valley and his mechanism for pressure was dismantled, and that was, under the circumstances, a real and meaningful result. Mrs. Greer came to the Carver place, which people in the valley had begun to call the Haskins place without quite deciding to, on a warm day in early April, riding in with a jar of preserved peaches and an expression of profound relief. "I slept properly last night for the first time in 6 months," she told Mary, sitting at the kitchen table with the peaches on the counter and coffee between them. "First time since before all of that started." She looked at Bernard. "You did that, you and your letters." "Mrs. Pierce did as much," Bernard said. "Mrs. Pierce did her part," Mrs. Greer said firmly. "And you did yours. Don't be modest about useful things." Spring came to the valley with the kind of sudden and total generosity that high country springs have, the snow pulling back up the slopes, the creek running high and cold and clear with snowmelt, the first green appearing in the fields with a quality of green that seemed almost architectural in its precision and brightness. Mary had her kitchen garden beds ready before the last frost risk had passed, because she was a person who prepared, and when the planting time came she was ready for it. Bernard had spent the winter in correspondence with 2 other families in the valley who were farming and needed some of the practical and legal knowledge he had accumulated, and in the spring he helped Carl Duplessis register a water rights claim that had been left informal for too long, and he spent 2 weeks helping Mrs. Greer's nephew, who had come from Kansas to help his aunt with spring work, understand the process for a homestead expansion. He was not what you would call a lawyer. He had no formal training, but he had learned enough about territorial land law in the past several years through necessity and attention, and he could read a document and understand what it meant and explain it to other people. And in a territory where legal help was scarce and expensive, this was not nothing. It was considerably more than nothing. In May, Mary told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, when they were both still at the breakfast table with the first coffee of the day, the way she told him most things, directly and without ceremony, but with a particular quality of attention in her eyes that said this was important. Bernard set down his coffee cup. He looked at her and felt something enormous move through him, something that had no adequate name except possibly the word future, or perhaps the word real, the feeling of something being absolutely real. "Well," he said, which was entirely inadequate but was the first word available. "Well," she agreed with a faint smile. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling fine," she said. "A little sick in the morning still, but it's been better this past week." He held her hand for a moment, and then he stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, as she always did, and he held her carefully and she put her head against his chest, and they stood in the kitchen in the morning light with the spring air coming through the open window and the dog at their feet. "I'm going to be good at this," he said, with the absolute conviction of a man who has made a resolution that he intends to keep. "I know," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I wouldn't have married you otherwise. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer." Mary slowed down some, not by choice but by the practical necessity of a body doing considerable work of its own, and she was honest about this without being self-pitying about it, which was characteristic. She redirected her energy from the heavy field work to the kitchen and the accounting and the planning, which were things that needed doing anyway. Bernard took on the physical work and hired Carl Duplessis's older boy, a 14-year-old named Marcel, who was serious and capable, and took tremendous pride in being useful, for the heavier field work during the harvest weeks. The summer valley was extraordinary, all long light and growing things and the smell of warm earth, and Bernard found that he had stopped noticing the horizon in the restless way he had been noticing it for most of his adult life. He noticed the horizon now because it was beautiful and because it was his, or rather it was theirs, the view from their particular piece of ground, and that was a different and much better thing. He wrote to Gideon Polk in New Mexico, who he owed an explanation and possibly some portion of the money from the original job, and Polk wrote back with the comfortable pragmatism of an old rancher who had seen enough of the world to not be surprised by much of it, saying the horses had all been recovered in the end by a different fellow, and he bore no grudge and congratulations on the marriage if it was deserved. Bernard also wrote to the land office in Denver to confirm that Thomas Rudd's portion of the original filing was properly handled following his death, and to make sure there was no administrative loose end that could complicate Mary's full ownership. The response came back that everything was in order, and he filed the letter in the small box where Mary kept her important documents, alongside the deed and the marriage certificate and her father's last letter. Thomas Rudd's grave in the New Mexico Canyon was not forgotten. Bernard wrote to the county office in the nearest New Mexico town with a description of the location and a request that it be officially recorded, and he and Mary talked about finding a way to place a proper marker there when the baby was older and travel was easier. Mary wanted a stone with his name and the dates. Bernard agreed that was the right thing and said they would do it. On a clear, cold night in October of 1874, exactly 1 year and a few weeks after Bernard had first ridden into Harlan Creek Valley with a dead man's message in his heart, their son was born. Mary's labor was managed by Mrs. Duplessis, who had attended births before and was calm and capable and bossy in the most reassuring way possible, and by the doctor who had arrived in Harlan Creek in the spring from Philadelphia, a young man named Dr. Marsh, who was earnest and very good at his work, and had come west because he wanted to be useful in places where useful was hard to find. Bernard spent the hours of labor in the barn doing unnecessary but energetically accomplished repairs, because there was nothing else available to him to do, and the barn was where the energy could go. When Mrs. Duplessis came to the barn door and told him he could come in, He walked into the bedroom and found Mary propped against pillows with the expression of someone who has done something very hard and very significant and is aware of both facts. And in her arms was a small red-faced person who was not doing anything in particular yet except existing, which was extraordinary enough. Bernard sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and felt the weight of everything that had happened since a dying man said a woman's name in a red canyon in New Mexico, and thought that if Thomas Rudd had known where his last words were going to land, he might have been pleased with the result. "He looks like someone," Bernard said, studying the baby with the attention he gave to things he found genuinely remarkable. "Babies generally do," Mary said, with the tired and specific humor of someone who has just done something tremendous. "Like someone specific," Bernard said. He looked at her. "I think he looks like you." Mary looked at the baby, whose eyes were not yet fully open but were making preliminary investigations of the world around them. "He has your ears," she said. "My ears are perfectly ordinary." "They are," she agreed. "That's not a criticism." They named him James Thomas Haskins. The Thomas was for Thomas Rudd, and they did not feel the need to explain this to anyone who did not already understand it. James Thomas was a large, healthy, loud, and tremendously interested baby who applied himself to every aspect of his early existence with apparent relentlessness. He was, in this, thoroughly characteristic of both of his parents. He slept in a crib that Bernard had made himself from ash wood over the winter, in the room that had been Mary's room alone and was now theirs, and he woke at irregular hours and made his opinions known about this, which were very strong opinions. Bernard Haskins discovered that he was, as he had predicted, very good at this. He was good at the night wakings, at the particular patience required for a small person who cannot explain what they need and must therefore be patiently worked through the options. He was good at the mornings when James was fussy and everything needed to be managed around it. He was good at all the small, careful attentions that parenthood required, because he was already a careful and attentive man, and this was simply the most important application of that quality. Mary recovered well and came back to her full self gradually and without complaint, and by spring she was back in the kitchen garden with James in a basket in the shade nearby, narrating her planting to him with a straight-faced seriousness that Bernard found entirely charming. The valley had changed somewhat with the resolution of the vicar's situation. There was a general sense of stability that had not been there before, a feeling among the small farmers and homesteaders that their position was more secure. This encouraged investment, both of money and of commitment, and through 1875 Bernard watched several families put down more permanent roots, improving their houses, expanding their garden plots, adding to their livestock. He continued his work of helping people navigate land law and water rights, and the administrative complexities of territorial status. By the end of 1875, he had a small but genuine reputation in the valley as someone who could be trusted with documents in difficult situations, and Reverend Calloway had suggested, not for the first time, that Bernard might consider taking on a formal role in town, perhaps assisting the justice of the peace, who had been overwhelmed with an increasing volume of land claims as the territory grew. Bernard thought about this through the winter of 1875 and into the spring of 1876, because he was a careful thinker about anything that involved changing the structure of his life. He talked about it extensively with Mary, who was exactly the person he needed to talk to because she was practical and honest and had no investment in telling him what he might want to hear. "You'd be good at it," she said one evening, James asleep in the next room and the fire going and the winter outside once again doing its annual work. "You're already doing most of it without the title. The title would just make it official and give you a legal standing to do it better." "It would mean being in Harlan Creek more," he said. "Less time on the farm." "Marcel is getting older and more capable every year," she said. "We can afford him more hours when you're in town." The farm doesn't need both of us on it full time. It needs both of us committed to it, which is different." He looked at her across the fire. "You be all right with that, Bernard," she said, with a patience that was affectionate. "I managed a farm alone for 2 years. I am extremely confident in my ability to manage it with a husband who comes home every evening." She paused. "Besides, when this one arrives," she said, with the particular phrasing that she had been using for the past 2 months to refer to the fact of a second pregnancy that was still early but progressing well, "I'll have enough to occupy me without needing you underfoot all day." He smiled. "Underfoot." "Productively underfoot," she amended graciously. "But still." He took the role in the spring of 1876, working with Justice Callahan, a fair-minded man who was grateful for the assistance, on land claims and water rights disputes and the various administrative tangles that a growing territorial district generated. It was the most formal employment Bernard had held in his adult life, and it suited him in ways he had not entirely anticipated. The structure of it, the sense of concrete progress, the satisfaction of a dispute resolved cleanly. He rode into Harlan Creek 3 mornings a week on a good bay horse, a better animal than his original mount, bought from a rancher in the valley who was improving his herd. He was known in town now, greeted by name, asked for opinions and advice. He was still recognizably the man who had ridden in from New Mexico with a dying man's message, but he was also something more and different now, a man who had found his proper location in the world and was filling it. Their second child was born in September of 1876, a girl this time, delivered again by Mrs. Duplessis and Dr. Marsh, with less drama than James's arrival had involved. They named her Clara Ann for Mary's mother who had died when Mary was 15. Clara arrived in the world quieter than her brother, looking at everything with the particular intensity of a person who prefers to observe before forming opinions, which was a quality she seemed to have settled into before she was 24 hours old. James was nearly 2, large for his age and entirely too curious about everything, and he greeted the arrival of his sister with the combination of suspicion and fascination that small children bring to new siblings. His initial suspicion gave way over the following weeks to a proprietary pride that was entirely characteristic of everything he did, and he could be found standing at Clara's basket with the expression of someone who has been put in charge and takes this responsibility extremely seriously. The life that filled those years was the life Bernard had been building toward without having a blueprint for it. The rhythms of the farm and the town, the work of the land and the work of the community, the evenings by the fire and the cold mornings, and the hot summers and the tremendous beauty of the valley in every season. Mary's kitchen garden expanded every year, and she began selling surplus vegetables and preserved goods to the general store in Harlan Creek, which Holland bought at fair prices, and which gave her a small independent income that she kept in her own account and regarded with great satisfaction. Bernard filed the necessary paperwork over the following year and got the spring on Mrs. Greer's land officially restored to its proper course, which required a longer legal process than anyone had hoped, but which succeeded in the end. Mrs. Greer came to the door of their house on the day the final document arrived with her jaw set, and her eyes very bright, and said "thank you" in a voice that did not entirely manage to be steady. And Mary brought her inside and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table for a long time talking about things that had nothing to do with legal documents. Carl and Elise Duplessis became friends, real friends of the kind that form between people who have shared difficulty and come through it together. And their family and the Haskins family shared Sunday meals through the years that followed with a regularity that became one of the steady, pleasant facts of life. Their children were of similar ages and got into similar trouble, which was the foundation of lasting friendship between young people. In the spring of 1878, Bernard and Mary rode down to New Mexico Territory, leaving James and Clara with Elise Duplessis for 2 weeks. They rode to the canyon where Thomas Rudd had died, and they found the spot by Bernard's careful memory of the landscape, the red walls and the trickle of creek, and the particular angle of the stone that had been above the body. Bernard had the stone with him, carved by a stonecutter in Trinidad who had done good work, gray granite with Thomas Rudd's name and the dates, and the simple word friend carved below. They set it over the grave together, Bernard working the stone into the ground so it would stand. Mary stood over it for a long time afterward without speaking, her hand resting on the top of the stone, and Bernard stood beside her and gave her the silence she needed. She said, finally, "He would have liked you." "You think so?" Bernard asked. "He liked men who did what they said they would," she said. "He didn't find many. He would have liked you enormously." She turned and looked at Bernard with her steady brown eyes and something behind them that was both sad and at peace. "Thank you for coming," she said. "That first morning, thank you for stopping." "I told him I would," Bernard said. "I know," she said, "but a lot of people tell dying men things they don't follow through on. You did." She took his hand. "You changed my life by following through." They rode back to Colorado Territory through the high desert autumn, through the red and gold country where the light came down in long amber shafts, and Mary rode beside him with her hair come loose from its pins in the wind and her face open to the sky. And Bernard watched her when he thought she wasn't looking and thought about the morning he had come around the second bend of the creek and seen her standing at the white gate. She had already known why. He still thought about that, what it had meant. She had told him some months after that Thomas Rudd had been ill on and off for the year before his death, that she had suspected something might happen, that his correspondence had become sporadic and then stopped, and that she had had a feeling in the weeks before Bernard arrived that something was coming. Not a mystical thing, she said, but the practical knowledge of someone who has been paying attention to the signals. "I saw you coming down the road," she had told him, "and I saw you were not a local man and you were riding like you had somewhere specific to be, and I just knew. The way you knew yourself when Thomas was asking you. Some things have a particular quality." Bernard had thought about that for a long time. The particular quality of things that were true and necessary, that announced themselves through some channel that was not quite conscious but was reliable. He had felt it in the canyon when Thomas Rudd gripped his arm. He had felt it standing in Mary's kitchen that first morning with the coffee and the herbs drying from the rafters. He felt it every morning when he woke in their room with the pale, early light coming through the window and her beside him. They came back to Harlan Creek Valley on a Friday evening. The valley spread below them in the last of the sunset light, the farms and the creek and the dark line of pines on the ridgeline and the white spire of the church catching the orange light. And Mary put her hand on his arm on the road above the valley, and they stopped their horses for a moment and just looked. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed. They rode down into it, and Elise Duplessis's house was warm with light, and they could hear the children through the window before they reached the door. James's particular variety of noise and Clara's quieter presence in the background of it. And when James heard the horses and understood it was his parents, he came out the door before anyone could stop him, hatless and bootless in the cold evening air, and launched himself with supreme confidence at Bernard, who caught him with the ease of much practice. "Papa," James said with great authority. "James," Bernard said, "you're cold. Where are your boots?" "Inside," James said. "Are you back now? Are you staying?" "We're back," Bernard said. "And we're staying." "Good," James said, with the profound satisfaction of someone for whom this is the correct and proper answer. "Clara missed you. I didn't." "You didn't," Bernard said gravely. "Not much," James amended and put his arms around Bernard's neck. Mary laughed. Bernard looked at her over the top of James's head in the cold evening air, with the valley behind them and the light in the Duplessis window and Clara's face appearing now in the open doorway in Elise's arms, and he felt the full and complete weight of a life that had come true, the particular gravity of everything that was real and earned, and not going anywhere. He thought about a canyon in New Mexico and a dying man's voice, and the name Mary Carver spoken into the red desert air with such urgency and such tenderness. He thought about riding north for 2 weeks carrying someone else's love like a letter in his chest, and not knowing yet what was waiting at the other end. He thought about a white gate on an autumn morning, and a woman standing at it with steady brown eyes who already knew why he had come. Some things had a particular quality. Thomas Rudd had known it, spending his last breath on a name. Bernard Haskins had felt it in a canyon and followed it north through the high desert and the aspen gold, and it had brought him to the right gate, the right woman, the right life. He carried James inside and took Clara from Elise's arms and handed James to Mary, and stood in the warm kitchen full of children and friends. And he thought, as he had thought every day since that first morning, that a promise made to a dying man had been kept in every possible sense. Over the years that followed, the Haskins farm became one of the most established small holdings in the valley, not the largest, not the wealthiest, but the most thoroughly itself. Mary added a small orchard of apple and plum trees along the eastern boundary of the land in 1879, and by 1882, the first real harvest of apples was pressed into cider and preserved into jams that were sold at the general store, with a handwritten label that said Haskins Orchard in Mary's clear and careful script. Bernard's work with the justice of the peace eventually resulted in his being appointed a formal land registrar for the district, a position that gave him an official standing in all the various disputes and claims that a growing territory continued to generate. He was good at the work, thorough and fair, and not intimidated by money or influence, and the reputation he had built for honesty and precision made him effective in ways that a more easily compromised person could not have been. James grew into a tall, serious young man who had his mother's practical intelligence and his father's quiet steadiness, and who at 12 years old announced that he intended to study law, which announcement was received with the particular pride that parents feel when a child independently arrives at something that makes complete sense. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable interior life, quiet and observant and enormously capable, who had from a very early age been deeply interested in plants and growing things, and who became, by her early adolescence, her mother's most valued collaborator in the orchard and garden. A third child came in 1880, another son, named William, who was entirely different from both of his siblings in personality, louder and more physical and more immediately social, and who from the time he could walk treated the world as a series of interesting problems to be run at directly. The house grew with the family. A room added on the east side in 1879, when William's imminent arrival made the original configuration insufficient, and a proper parlor added in 1882 because Mary had always wanted a room that was specifically for sitting and reading that was not also the kitchen. The rocking chair from the original porch was moved into the new parlor and was the chair where Mary sat to read aloud in the evenings, the reading aloud having continued through all the years, growing from Jane Eyre and Tennyson into a wide range of books that came from the library that now existed in Harlan Creek, established in 1879 by a committee of which Mary was a founding member. The children sat on the rug at her feet, and the dog, Copper's successor, a young red shepherd named Hazel, occupied the rug with them, and Bernard sat in the chair across from Mary's and listened to his wife's voice fill the room with stories. He thought sometimes on those evenings about the version of himself who had been 19 and walking west with everything he owned and a great deal of empty space in front of him. He would not have recognized this room or this life. He would not have been able to imagine it. But he would have wanted it, he thought, if he had somehow been able to see it, in the way that young people can want things they cannot articulate yet because they have no words for what is not yet real. Thomas Rudd's stone stood in the New Mexico Canyon, and every year Mary put the date of his death in the family ledger beside a line that read friend and benefactor, And every year they talked about him a little, told the children something about him, kept him from being entirely lost to the past. The children knew the story of how Bernard had come to Harlan Creek, knew about the canyon and the dying man's words, and James in particular had grown up with a gravity about it that had shaped his interest in law. The idea that the right word said to the right person at the right moment could change everything. The particular quality of things that were true and necessary. On a morning in the late spring of 1884, 11 years after Bernard Haskins had first ridden up the valley road and seen the white gate, he stood at that gate with a cup of coffee in the morning air and looked out at the road and then back at the house, at the smoke from the kitchen chimney and the apple trees in early bloom along the eastern boundary and the barn where Marcel, now a grown man with his own farm nearby, was bringing the horses in from the overnight paddock. The world was different than it had been in 1873. The territory was growing, the railroad had come through the region and changed the economics of everything. Denver was a real city now, and all of the uncertainties and roughnesses of the early territorial days had smoothed into something more settled. It was still the West, still hard and beautiful and demanding in ways that a softer landscape was not, but it was a West that had developed more structure and more permanence, and Bernard was part of that structure in a way he had not imagined when he was riding the open country with a pack and no fixed address. He heard the screen door and Mary came out with her own coffee, wearing the blue work dress that had replaced the original blue dress she had worn on the morning they first met, the same color by choice because she liked it. Her hair had a few threads of silver in it now, barely visible, and she wore it in the same practical way she always had. She came to stand beside him at the gate and looked at the same road he was looking at. Thinking quietly, she said. That's allowed, he said. Always, she agreed. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her. They looked at the road and the valley and the early morning light coming over the ridge in long amber shafts, the same light that had always been there, the reliable and extravagant beauty of this particular piece of the world. I was thinking about that morning, he said. I know, she said. You look the same way you look when you're thinking about that morning. What does that look like? She considered. Like someone who still finds it remarkable, she said, that it all worked out. Don't you? He asked. She looked at the gate, the white painted wood of it under their hands, and then at him, and her face had the open quality it had always had when she was being completely honest, the composed dignity set fully aside and what was underneath it fully present. Every single day, she said. He tightened his arm around her. From inside the house came the sounds of the morning beginning in earnest, William's particular brand of arrival in the kitchen, Clara's voice saying something quiet and patient in response, and above it all James's deeper voice, back for the summer from his studies in Denver, reading something aloud to himself in the parlor, because he had inherited the reading aloud without apparently noticing he had done so. The apple trees were in bloom. The creek was running high with the snowmelt of another spring. The gate was white and solid and had been repainted twice over the years and would be repainted again, because the gate mattered, and things that mattered were worth the maintenance. A dying man had said a woman's name in a red canyon in New Mexico in the autumn of 1873, and the name had been Mary Carver, and the man who received it had been Bernard Haskins, and he had ridden north because he had promised, and she had been standing at the white gate when he arrived, because she already knew the particular quality of certain arrivals. And what had come from all of it was this: a morning in the spring, and a house full of children and light, and the smell of coffee and apple blossoms, and a woman beside him at the gate she had painted white with her own hands, and the road ahead of them that was not a horizon to chase any more but simply the world they lived in together, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.